Hello, my name is Paul Stevenson. I'm going to talk to you today about my new book, Hard Drive, which is published by Carcanet in June. It's my first collection, my debut, a book that has taken 7 years to bring into the world. I published 3 pamphlets previously in 2015, 2016, 2017, so it's been 6 years since I last brought together some poems. Now, this isn't quite the book I thought would be my first collection. I imagined it would be quite another book that maybe draws on the best of my writing from the last 15 years, selecting from the pamphlets, collecting other work. But it had to be this book ultimately because these are the poems that really matter to me, that felt to be the most urgent and the most accomplished. So this book is entirely distinct. It contains poems written since June 2016, which was an eventful summer on many levels. What are the main themes of this book? At face value, I guess it's a book about grief and bereavement, a set of poems that explores the aftermath of a death, of the death of a long-term partner and a gay relationship, a first serious relationship, a formative relationship. But I think the poems speak to anybody who has lost someone close and had to deal with the aftermath of a death on both a practical and emotional level. It deals with how you go into a kind of overdrive to get stuff done. So the book explores grief in its various guises and attempts to come at its slant. It's not really just a book about death, though. I would say it is first and foremost a book about friendship and about family and those left behind. And the friendship that is so essential when you need support in those difficult times, when there's so much to deal with. To get done. And then there's the grief you feel, of course, not only for the person that's died, but for the loved ones left behind and from whom you may be separated geographically. So the poems also acknowledge the many close but rather fleeting professional relationships that you have with administrators, with undertakers, organisers. And in a sense, it's also a celebration of those people. There are lots of secondary characters in the book, all of whom I give names to. They all have their own personalities, which I hint at. And so I guess it's sort of like a soap opera of bereavement, if you like. And this probably makes sense given my other work and the way in which people feature predominantly in many of my poems. So the book is an elegy. It's one big elegy, a book of poems that celebrates somebody who's passed and tries to capture the essence of someone by creating a kind of inventory of everything they were into and everything they were. The poems try to capture the essence of that person and the relationship with that person over many years. In some senses, it's a dialogue with the dead. And indeed, there are quite a few poems that are in direct address, using the second person. It's a book that also explores, I think, the absurdity of life and death, the human comedy. Some of the poems use humour as a way to process feelings of anger, feelings of guilt, regret, denial. Some of the poems invent language to try to more accurately communicate and convey and capture what it really feels like to go through these various processes, rituals, performances that come with dealing with the death. And it's also a book that explores the complete and utter self-indulgence of grieving. How at times the person who's died almost becomes a secondary character in a very self-absorbed drama on the part of the writer in this case. And I realised I was writing about self-indulgence and the ego. And I realised I was also writing poems at one stage about the act of writing and the kind of ethical dilemmas there. Very conscious of what I was doing, writing poems about death and with a view to the poems themselves being published and being read, the poems becoming a kind of commodity. And also realising that, in the process of doing this, you are fictionalizing a person, you're writing from life, but that person becomes maybe a little even bit more distant from you. You're only telling one side of the story. And indeed, this is a story. This is a story told in poems. It much of it has a linear narrative. These are poems that take place in various settings, largely in London at the beginning, but then there are poems set in America and in Europe, in France, Portugal, Georgia. So it's a little bit of a travelogue as well, I suppose. How did I write the poems? Well, most were drawn from lived experience, obviously. Very painful experience. Some poems emerged naturally, others through writing prompts. I drew on some of the official documentation that you have to deal with. And I also used dialogue quite a lot to recreate some of the conversations I had at the time. I didn't want this to be a somber book about death where the reader's emotional response was conditioned from the first page. It was very important to me that with each poem, every time the reader turns the page, they have to negotiate their own response, whether it's to feel sorrowful and sad, or to smile or laugh. It's not intended consciously as a sort of emotional roller coaster, but I sought to capture the kind of mixed bags of emotions that come with grief, that take you by surprise, that are often very surprising and unpredictable when you go through a long grieving process, a process that never really ends, of course. I attended a few writing workshops and I worked with prompts from poets and friends. And of course, when you've got such a massive event hanging over you that you need to explore and investigate, then, everything that you're given as stimulus, you will then use as a channel through which to explore what is essentially your main preoccupation, is trying to come to terms with the death of someone so close. How did I feel about putting this selection together, and how did I do it? Well, I submitted a couple of manuscripts actually in June 2021 to the Carcanet window, and talked to Michael and John in January 22. I was delighted that they were interested in the manuscript and thought it was original. And I spent then much of 2022 editing the manuscript with John. Only a few poems have since emerged in the editing process. Most of the poems were already written, and to be honest, I didn't really want to write any more. So I ended up with a manuscript that I submitted, but I had a whole other set of secondary poems I kept back. So then there was a whole discussion about which of those poems to consider. Some I'd held back from the original manuscript because I thought they took certain risks I was unsure of, the way in which I was using the material. So I was very, very grateful to John for some very fine discussion, extended discussions about the poems, and for his belief in some of the poems that otherwise I'd kept out. I suppose at one point I envisaged a book of 3 sections and wondered if the latter part of the book, the going back in time, in the second half of the book, would one day be a second book, actually, like a prequel. But in the end, it seemed natural to include poems that explored a life together, as well as those initial poems of dealing with someone who has departed. So the initial manuscript I submitted was in 5 sections. I've ended up with 6 sections in the end. And indeed, in many ways, the book does operate like a novel in poems. The first 3 parts adopt more or less a linear narrative. They're more or less chronological. So in the first 3 sections, called Signature, Officialdom, and Clearing Shelves, they zoom in on the aftermath in the weeks that follow, in quite minute detail, really, zooming in on some of the rituals, the processes, the things you have to do. And then the 4th and 5th parts, covered Reservoir and Intentions, go back in time to explore the relationship a little bit more, living together, traveling together, having a common life, the adventures, but also the tensions that come with a long-term relationship. And then the final part, Attachment, steps out and zooms out to take very conscious or self-conscious take on what the writer is actually doing. I realised that, writing death was itself a subject of the poem that I hadn't really read much on elsewhere, and I thought was valid as its own section. So I brought that in as a 6th part. And how did it feel writing the book? Well, a kind of mix of emotions, as you can imagine. On the one hand, a sense of urgency, of imperative, a need and compulsion to write the poems, put them into the world, tell my story. But at the same time, lots of reservation about what I was doing, questions about permission, ethics, legitimacy of being overly subjective. It's only my side of what happened. And I'm sure everybody who writes about the death of a loved one also has to contend with those tensions, those conundrums, those ethical dilemmas. Ultimately, I tried to justify what I was doing, I suppose, in terms of making art, making beautiful something out of all the sort of pain and heartache, to try to arrive at some kind of original perspective on death and loss, to write a book that I thought would take risks and do something new, by using form, using constraint, by interrogating language, embracing new vocabulary, maybe even discussing situations that I hadn't read about before. So finding my own way of speaking, really. I'd also consider I suppose a way of justifying what I'm doing is also sort of considering the whole process over 6-7 years as a collaboration of sorts, a continuation of a relationship, certainly a dialogue. A lot of the poems, as I said, are in direct address. So I would like to just say thanks to everyone at Carcanet for all their support throughout this process. Thank you to Michael and John initially for believing in the manuscript, and to John for looking over so many poems and seeing the worth in some of the poems I dismissed. And thank you to Andrew in particular, who's been very patient with me with all the corrections. It's a big book of 130 pages, and there were lots of long-lined poems, lots of prose poems where it really mattered to me that we get the words at the end of the line right as they were published in magazines, and that meant a lot of proofs going back and forth. And so thank you for your patience. And thanks to Jazz and Lucy and all at Carcanet for working with me over the last 18 months to produce this book, which has for me been a long time coming, and a book which I hope you will all appreciate reading. Thank you.